Okay, we're going to go ahead and get back to the discussion at hand. So we've had an opportunity to hear a couple points on this. Ms. Conroy?
Shifting gears just a little bit, as we go forward with this process and we start to process some of the community input, I'd like us to stay open to looking to more revenue enhancements. I've heard a lot of really creative ideas from community members, and I think as that comes in, no matter what amount we could come up with, that's a little bit less that we have to deduct. So I'd really like to see us spend some time looking at some more revenue enhancements.
Okay,
and I would say that any revenue enhancements that we can add to this, you know, that people are comfortable with, we're great. We'd love to do that anytime that we can have the revenue enhancements instead of making reductions. The problem, of course, is that we've had some long discussions this last year about the size of our fees, you know, what we charge for and what we don't charge for, et cetera. Certainly some of the reductions that we're talking about might not have to be reductions, but may be structured in a more of a tuition-based method or a payment-based method, so that the actual services aren't lost, but just that they're paid for. And so it's revenue neutral in terms of that.
I think that you hear a lot of that. You hear a lot of people saying, I'd rather pay for this or add to this as opposed to cut this. Is there, Dr. Krizik or Ms. Masterton, is there any way that we can gauge the community's feeling on how they feel about that?
I can't answer that question. That's a good question. But I think this board has prided itself, Ms. Conroy, on being able to justify what goes into the fees that we charge, so that when we look at student fees, it's related to the consumables. It's related to hard costs that we're not a district that has an arbitrary fee. And so while you know, there may be many community members that say if we could just add $50 more, I do believe we have a responsibility to justify what that's going to, what parents are getting in return in terms of those supplies. So I don't know what that saturation point is. One of the revenue enhancements already is adding $35 on for a technology fee, so that certainly is going to increase. Certainly, charging students for the use of their planners can certainly be a revenue neutral kind of a thing, and certainly that just might be revenue neutral, and that will have some value. But I just would like to say I really applauded the board for having integrity in which they've based their fee costs on, that it's related to something tangible that parents can understand. So I'm not answering your question directly. I'm just trying to share with you the philosophy that this board has maintained to put us in a very defendable position to this community, which I would always want to continue to do, as opposed to having an arbitrary number to solve an issue, but then not being able to substantiate it at any point in the future. There can be a part of the population that would challenge that too. So I don't know this community saturation point. I do know that at the high school we have parents that would like us to figure out ways of doing textbooks differently, because that is an overwhelming cost for our families because we charge them for textbooks. To do that is to have a huge infusion of dollars to purchase those textbooks, and then that limits the teacher's ability to make any changes if there's any substantive changes in curriculum in order to give our students access to the best curriculum. So we do know that we've had our families ask us to try to solve a lot of different problems, and we try to do that the best we possibly can in the most responsible manner that we possibly can. Tonight we talked about summer school pieces, and there was a concern about $140 going from $95 to $149 for that. So I think there is very different constituents that are going to have different responses to that. But I'm just going to go back to having rationale for why you charge what you charge I think is paramount.
Before we go to additional board comment, Ms. Masterton, can you just make one clarification. When Mrs. Deroney asked you about the balanced budget scenario, I think you said that all three scenarios are balanced budgets, but really when you flow it out, they look very different. So it looks to me like fiscal year '09 is close to balance, but the impact of the cuts in the out years is really where we get out of balance. Is that correct?
That's correct. So you really actually have certain years where revenues are less than expenditures. Eventually, that flows back up again. So it's really almost a curve in there, particularly in the out years of 14 and 15 because of the projected increased new growth that would be coming in, assuming that the real estate market is finally picking up by that time. You're going to have more new growth, and that's going to pick up extra dollars. So when I was talking about balanced, in the long haul, it's a balanced scenario. But within different years, you may have at one year more revenue than expenditure, and another year more expenditure than revenue. So there's actual dip in around 12 and 13, and then it picks up again from there.
Okay, so again, the goal here tonight is to figure out how much, and then we'll frame the what goes in the how much in the upcoming weeks. Our initial throw out from Mr. Collins was $1.5 million. So we can react to that, or I'd be happy to hear what the recommendations from other board members are and how we would frame this and what your rationale is. Ms. Hirsch.
I'll do that for you, Mrs. Ostrich, but Mrs. Masterton, I have a question first. I'm looking at the new anticipated ed fund expenditures, and I think I'm misunderstanding something. It looks like the FY12 number adds up to $1.3 million, and you said that would be carried forward. Am I missing something? The curriculum adoptions are one-time fees, or am I missing something that those would be annualized?
We're annualizing curriculum adoptions because there's always the assumption that the curriculum, the way that the curriculum adoption schedule goes is every year there are curriculum adoptions. They spread out so that you're trying not to minimize so that not all the curriculum adoptions happen in one year and you're having a major influx of new dollars that have to be spent for curriculum. So
these
in
are
fiscal 11,
placeholders.
you'd have one adoption. In fiscal 12, you've got two adoptions for in the elementary. In fiscal 13, you may have another social studies adoption in the middle school and perhaps a relook at the math in elementary. In fiscal 14, we may be back into another literacy or reading adoption at some time.
In effect, these are placeholders for curriculum adoptions on an
Exactly.
annual basis.
Exactly.
Okay. My thoughts on the whole process, I'm concerned about several things, but in looking at this, I was driving myself crazy in terms of looking at CPI and trying to estimate what the CPI was going to be and trying to guess what the state was going to do and watching local races and trying to figure out who you think is going to win the governorship and when the taxes are going to go up and if they're going to go up and if they are actually going to pay their monies that are due to the state. And there are so many variables that I really came back down to we really are throwing a dart at a really big dartboard. Looking at out years, I think we really need to rein in our focus, especially given if we every cut that we are going to have to make, every reduction that we're going to have to make is affecting our students' experience, it's affecting our staff, it's affecting our community. And I want to be very cautious and very conservative. Those programs have been implemented in our present because we believed in them, and prior boards voted to fund them and decided that they were appropriate. Now, there's always room for improvement. There's always ways that we can become more efficient. But I am very, very hesitant to start cutting programs so that we feel more comfortable if the state decides to pay nothing. I think it was my conversation with Mr. Collins. I ratcheted back down to what is the absolute, what's our projected expenditures and what's our projected revenue. And now that we have the CPI, we know what those numbers are. That shows us at $350,000 in the red. And so that, for me, was the starting point. If we can come up with $650,000 worth of additional revenue for next year, okay, that's revenue that we can collect that's going to diminish that. And then adding back in, expecting a 10% reduction from the state I think you gave us the number, is $782,000. And so adding those numbers together, it's, you know, I have since learned that some of the new anticipated education fund expenditures, such as the ELL certified staff, are required, they're mandated, so there are some things that we're going to have to add back in. But really, I want to start at ground zero and look at the absolute minimum and put these curriculum adoptions also into consideration in terms of how we're going to get to that number. So in terms of the number, you know, the number that I was comfortable with was the $1.5 million, because that's how I started. My thought process was, let's start where our budgeted expenditures are, let's look at our expected revenue, let's look at what we are mandated to add, let's look at what we anticipate being conservative, the state's not going to pay the 10%. Add up all those things, and I came up with $1 million. And you know, $1.5 million, I think, is something between revenue generation and cost cuts, I think is a realistic, conservative approach on a one-year basis.
Mr. Collins, I'm sorry, Mr. Carlquist.
As much as I appreciate board members trying to do the role or the job of the district's finance business manager, I think, and as much as I can also appreciate the difficulty in trying to scale a number for a target for the reduction, which is what the objective is for tonight's meeting, without having you know, the circuitous aspect of understanding completely what the specific reductions would be, because 7 board members, you know, 40,000 community members, everyone is going to have a different sense as to where those cuts could come from, where revenue could be generated, and the like. And so I'll come back to, you know, in terms of tonight's objective, but I think what would be helpful, and Mrs. Oster, maybe you could comment. You know, this evening we got the yellow sheet, which is the timeline, and I think it's an important communications vehicle. I also appreciate the proposal for the Board of Education to conduct a public forum to be able to receive input. What I'm a little concerned about, though, is the process that we're on. The last meeting was specifically, the objective was specifically to provide context, some financial projections based on the, you know, review of the assumptions, scale the preliminary budget, and scale what that gap was. The objective for this evening was to say, what is the board's desire in our role, which our role as policy makers and to reflect the values of the community, what do we feel the magnitude of reductions ought to be? Then I think it's incumbent upon the administration, it's your job, to come back with a specific set of recommendations armed with input from the community, and we have forums based on our last meeting to be able to receive that, based on input from the professionals, the teachers and administrators in this district who we pay and are experts and we trust, and then be able to have that discussion. We haven't had that. We got a spreadsheet with a bullet on it at the last meeting. And Mr. Collins, I appreciate, you know, your and Ms. Hirsch's interest in getting together and kind of pinpointing textbook or curriculum adoption. And we've heard from the public this evening on some of the areas that have been brought up, which are all, you know, very worthy input, and there may be other ideas. We need to have that discussion, I think, before picking any one of these. So my comment or question was going to be is it not perhaps a bit out of sequence to propose having a public forum as the next meeting, February 9th, without having a presentation of recommendations to the Board of Education and some deliberation by the Board of Education to enable or prepare the community to be able to think, reflect, and focus then their input to the board based upon those preliminary plans, much like when we put a preliminary budget on display and the like, and then come back at the February 23rd meeting to be able to synthesize, you know, that information and refine if necessary, because that's all still prior to the March 9th. So that's just a question about sequencing, or at least something for the board to consider. I'll come back to our objective for tonight, which, again, I think all of us are perhaps feeling a bit, I mean, it's difficult without having that other piece, but I think from a policy statement, our I think it would be irresponsible for us not to set an objective of matching expenditures to revenues for next year. And the numbers that have been presented this evening, say based on the preliminary budget, the projection, the assumption, all which could change, at a minimum was $2,050,000 and could grow as much as $3,371,000. This was in Ms. Masterton's presentation. Now, there were some risks and with each one of those, including at the very lowest proposed level from the administration, which is at the $2 million level, exposures to cash reserves and the cash balance policy. And that's something that I don't think this board should take very lightly. But on the other hand, I also think that the future is uncertain, and that's why I threw out one way to at least contemplate a short-term or temporary bridge in terms of fund balance and reserves. But I think at a minimum, we should commit ourselves to being able to close a budget equation such that expenditures match the revenues, and that is either has to come up with incremental revenues that I'm wide open, and I'm looking for those, or reductions, and none of us like to make program reductions. Although I will share one anecdote I was thinking about, and seeing Ms. Chester here this evening, for example, who has been, is involved in our world language department, and I know the principal of the high school was here earlier. A number of years ago, the high school had plans to make a change in its world language, and they wanted to eliminate Latin from the curriculum at the high school. And that was a high school decision, but it came to the Board of Education because there was a big public outcry. I say big because there were emails from students and staff members, and there were emails from around the world of classics instructors and the like. And it was something that was very difficult for the Board of Education to in essence support or endorse the high school's recommendation to eliminate that class, because we fancied ourselves as a world-class high school, robust curriculum. We should have that. But what wasn't part of that conversation at that point in time exactly, or what we know now, the benefit, looking backwards, is the high school now offers Italian, the high school now offers Chinese, and so I think until we can have a conversation around budget cuts, rationale, an explanation of does it really make sense to offset health aides with RNs, or might it, because we haven't had that discussion. That I think it's very difficult to have us individually pick sort of our I won't say pet programs or interests or places to cut, but we as a board should set a policy level position on what we're prepared to do. And again, we pay you to work these numbers accurately, and we pay you as the superintendent to make thoughtful recommendations. Yes, we should test the veracity. Yes, we should facilitate and promote a forum for public input from the community. But frankly, I'm troubled, concerned at going with the bare minimum on this range, because I do think it puts cash reserves in jeopardy. It runs the risk of having us, putting us in a position of requiring even deeper cuts in subsequent years. But I would propose that we move forward with that minimum level as our objective, and have the second stage of this discussion, which is a presentation on the implications, maybe positive, maybe negative, associated with revenue or expense reductions in order to achieve that level, which presumably brings the budget in balance. We can always put monies back into the budget. We can always reinstate to a certain extent, but we are up against particularly those that relate to personnel costs. And then the last piece in this, I think the comment was made this evening, the quotation, and I think it's an admirable one, and I continue to strive or search for it. It's, can you find another way? And I think that's what we're all looking for. 3% reduction is Ms. Masterton, $2 million, which was your floor level of the range that you proposed. That's 3%. Is that correct? 3% is $3 million. So we're at about 1.95 to 2% roughly. So.
Thank you. With the 2.4, it'd be about 2.5%.
Because I think I bring that up lastly because when we start talking around numbers and the scale of our budget, these are very large numbers. These are very large numbers. But when you put it in terms of a percentage of reductions, organizations, entities that all of us are involved with, whether it be a club, a corporation, a government agency and the like, in these times, reductions of 2% is not that out of line. It's nothing. Now we have to move to the next step. If we commit ourselves to a 2% reduction, now we need to move to the next step of figuring out how we make that happen.
Mrs. Davy.
I'll be happy to answer where I think we should be, but I do have a couple clarifying questions. Ms. Masterton, when we had a presentation a couple weeks ago on the projections out, you showed us the same slide with the anticipated education fund expenditures. You showed us, is it the same slide from then as now? And were the same dollars put in the projections then as we saw in tonight's projection? Well, then what contributed to them being as different as they are tonight? Because I think there's an assumption that all those fund expenditures weren't included in the slide we saw 2 weeks ago.
No, they were all included. Actually, when we projected and gave you projections of the 3.329 in reductions and 400 and some thousand in enhancements and revenue enhancements, that was just like, not break even, but it was just comfort level, good projections on there. We've actually brought that down a whole $1 million per year, and that's because of the CPI change to 2.7% over the 1.5. So, in essence, what we're doing is we're saying there's $1 million more coming in for us. The projections remain the same, except that we've also added in the state concerns in there. So, our comfort level is much more in the range of 2.4, meaning 1.9 in reductions and $400,000 plus in revenue enhancements, along with those curriculum adoptions and staffing changes, et cetera, that are included in both projections.
And so the presentation changed this afternoon, and it was changed based on some additional administrative reductions that were put on the table. And then the scenarios in general, I'm trying to just synthesize this, and then in general, the scenario this week changed because we knew the CPI, and we also factored in 10% of reductions in state monies, plus then a few tweaks, if you will, of some additional administrative. So those were the changes from 2 weeks ago to tonight. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I think that's really important. And then I guess I want to get to where I would be comfortable weighing in, and I think what I've heard from some board members, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but what I've heard is that we need to relook at our new anticipated fund expenditures when we're looking at the whole picture reductions. I think that we put those on the table with everything else when we give the superintendent her marching orders as to what that final number is that a compromise to get to where we need to go tonight? If we all agree on one of these three numbers, and within that number, then add the caveat that when you come to a final recommendation, it includes relooking at the anticipated educational fund expenditures as well. It may stay that your recommendation may be to keep them all, but it at least gives the public the indication that we're relooking at everything that is out there. I
certainly think that's doable, with the exception of those that are going to be required of us to do.
I think we understand that. Yeah. I think we understand there's some
The other
mandate.
thing that I think is important to understand too is that projections change based on which reductions are on the table or not on the table. For instance, there is some concern, for instance, in terms of health services, that we may have to increase nurses, and this was a way to deal with a twofold problem. You may notice that the reduction is not that much, but it isn't taking into consideration the fact that there are increased health concerns that would mean that we not only would have the salaries for the health aides, but we would have additional nursing services cost included. So when you take that off, not only are you saving $139,000, you're also costing, more to the district, because we will need more certified, not necessarily certified school nurses, but RNs and certified school nurses. So there's that. There's other things that affect, one thing affects another thing in terms of that. And so, it's confusing to deal with, and it's something that we have gone around and around and around in trying to work out all of that. And certainly I agree with Mr. Karkos that a lot of the explanations, need to come forward. But when you pick and choose, like it's a laundry list, and say, oh, maybe not this and maybe not that, then that does have some additional expenditures as a possibility, or some different changes that come about through all of that. So just so that you know, for instance, an easy one to say, we can't get the middle school science books anymore. They're out of print, they're out of stock, we can't get them.
That's not true right now.
Not now? You can get them. You found them.
No, that was,
Last week.
that's health.
Oh, health. Okay, so.
You can't get the health test.
Okay, I'm just going to pull back on this, because again, I think that to Mrs. Davies' point, that's the conversation. Once we get the how much, if that's one of the things on the table, that would be the time for that discussion. I'm just going to ask one clarifying question, and then I'm going to let Mr. Collins go. But when we've got these three scenarios, so you've got scenario one is the $2 million reduction, and within that, I think the difference between this $2.2 million ending number and the million or million and a half is really the assumption of the 10% of the state revenues. This assumes, all of these scenarios assume we don't get 10% of the state revenues, correct? So with the $2 million, if we get that if we don't get reduced by $700,000, then we get closer to what, I think if I'm trying to figure out the math, and maybe I'm jumping ahead of you, that's really where you guys are coming from, is you're saying it's this scenario and we're not going to assume we get a 10% reduction. The $2 million assumes, is in there? Okay, then I'm not sure of the math, but so the $2 million does assume a 10% reduction. The $2,390,000 assumes, is that the 20%? And
Still 10. That's what's constant.
so it's just how far out we're going to go with our cash before we start to get to the uncomfortable zone. So fiscal year 11, under the $2 million, we get down below the $1 million that you were indicating. We're 1 year further out, and beyond that, in fiscal year 13, it gets pretty scary. In the scenario $2,390,000, we get to $1.5 million in fiscal year 12. And again, in the out years, as we've all said, there's too much at play in the scenarios to really get firm. And the top scenario is the one where we really maintain our fund balances at the high 28% of our revenue. Thank you for clarifying. Mr. Collins.
I didn't get to weigh in on my choice, may I?
Okay.
I'll be brief. I think that we have to have a balanced budget. Then I think the second most important thing is the low cash point, not having to issue tax anticipation warrants. And the third of these is the 25% fund balance for me, which is our policy. So I think that the lowest option, which is the little over $2 million, which was is $1.5 million in reductions, gets us a balanced budget and no need to, from this scenario, issue tax anticipation warrants. And I also agree it's dangerous to go out even 3 years because of so many uncertainties. So I'm really looking at 11 and 12, and I'm thinking that we would be okay at that level pending assumptions like just getting a 10% state reduction, which probably, it may be worse, but I think we're being responsible that we added it in from 2 weeks ago. I thank you for hearing our concerns and adding that into the scenario, because we didn't have any state reduction 2 weeks ago. And so I thank you for listening to that, so I would be comfortable with the lowest of the scenarios.
Okay, so just to confirm, that's the $2 million reduction scenario.
Well, it's a combination reduction and revenue enhancement, yeah.
Mr. Collins.
Thank you. First of all, Mr. Carlquist, I am flattered that you would think that I would be capable of doing Ms. Masterton's or Dr. Krisik's job. However, I think I have made it very clear to both of them, I have no desire to have their jobs. That's a sign. I have no desire to have their jobs, nor do I think I can do them. However, the accounting I went through is relatively simple. Even a guy from the University of Chicago can do it. So, but I think we are saying the exact same thing in many different words. I completely agree. We need, our expenditures cannot exceed our revenues in any given year. I agree with Mrs. Davey. It is dangerous just because of all the uncertainties in our economy. We are in unprecedented times. That to go out any further than 2 or 3 years and find out that we made a whole lot of decisions that cost our kids an experience that they could have had if our crystal ball was just a little sharper in focus, but it's just, that crystal ball is just not available to us. And all I'm saying is that we just lay out everything. At 2:35 this afternoon, the new presentation went out to all of us. And the difference between it and the old one is the new one just assumed that we were spending all the proposed money. And I'm just saying, let's just lay it all out. Let's go back to the pre-2:35 this afternoon and just have it all on the option table. I mean, I don't have anyone think that I am not in favor of a new science curriculum. I certainly am. But I just want to listen to the community, and if there is stuff on here that is required by law, let's change that. I was just not aware that any of this was required by law. So, but I wasn't focused on it. I was just focused on our task at hand tonight, not all of our options.
Just one point, I'm going to let Dr. Krisik speak. We didn't change numbers in here this afternoon. What got changed was some bullet points. It was informational. So that, and I'll let Dr. Krisik address that, but that roll through didn't get changed in today's presentation.
I just want to reaffirm that we only synthesized some slides and added some clarity to slides and helped to add some slides to help focus the conversation. We didn't change any numbers, none. We didn't change any numbers in any of the scenarios we presented. Those stayed constant. We didn't change those. We only changed, the only thing that we presented tonight was that we've added some additional administrative option reduction options, which gives us a total number larger. But we did not then go into this whole spreadsheets and change everything based on those new numbers. So all we did was add a few slides, took a few slides out, resequenced a few slides. But at the end of the day, everything that we presented to you on Friday in the PowerPoint in terms of content of numbers stayed constant.
And it's I'm certainly not infallible, and it's certainly possible that the reordering in the short amount of time confused me. However, I mean, I guess this is all not germane to the discussion. I think the basic points are we need to live within our means, and we need to lay it all out and listen carefully to the community as to what our values are.
Thank you. And Mr. Carlquist, before I get to you, I'm going to give Mrs. DeRoni a chance to voice in on
Ms. Masterton has something to say, I think.
Just clarify one thing. In these scenarios, both in the $2,050,000 scenario and the $2,390,000, we are not in a balanced budget in fiscal 12. We are spending more than we're receiving. So when you consider that as being, part of it, eventually it evens itself back out, but in fiscal 11, you are receiving more than you're spending in both scenarios, but by fiscal 12, your fund balances is dropping down again, and you're spending more than you're receiving. It then starts going back up again due to the inclusion, which we hope, of new property onto the rolls. So if you are looking for a balanced budget every single year, you would have to actually make more than the $2.39 million in revenue enhancement and cost reductions to balance every single year. Everybody wave your arms. Yeah.
Okay. I think we framed this that we're really looking at the 2010, 2011 budget, and we're not trying to forecast in the out years. That's really the decisions we're making tonight. So I'm going to just give Mrs. Deroni a chance to sound in on quantity, because we haven't been able to hear.
I'll try to be brief. I just want to make sure that the administration understands where I'm coming from when we talk about both adding things to the budget and suggesting reductions. I think it's your job to figure out how a combination of those two things is going to get us where we want to go in alignment with our strategic plan, what's best for the students in our district. I don't think we want to say, well, let's keep everything we had and add nothing new. I think that's a dumb way to make decisions about where we want to go. I think we want to figure out what's best, what we get if, in fact, we have to take away something that we've loved for X number of years. So I just want to be sure that that's clear. I'm also convinced by all of the uncertainties that we've talked about that to go with this very lowest number of $1.5 million is not conservative. I mean, we've used the word conservative here, but I've got to be more conservative than that. I have to go with the middle number of the 2.3 based on what you just said 10 seconds ago, and based on the conversation that we've had tonight with the teacher salary uncertainty, with the state being such a mess. There's just too many uncertainties for me to go with this rock bottom number, at least to start out with. So I would go with the middle number.
Mr. Kralkwitz.
First of all, Mr. Collins, I didn't mean to be critical, and in fact, I know, and in fact, as you know, I didn't mean to be so presumptuous that you couldn't do Ms. Masters' job. In fact, I'm quite confident you could. But what you and I both know is that we could, as a district, we couldn't afford you. You're far too expensive. Ms. Masters, a question for you: at the $2 million rate, or the $2 million combination of revenue enhancement and reductions, however that is constituted, understand your caveat, your concern about then based on the pro forma projections in the out years, it would, at least given the current assumption, would require the board to make additional reductions at even a greater level in subsequent years. Can you scale that again? Because I think, again, what the board is saying is acknowledgement of that risk, recognition that there's potential variability in the assumptions. It could get worse or it could get better. But can you scale again for us at that minimal reduction level in order to bring in a balanced budget, avoid tax anticipation warrants, and preserve at least, hold steady the cash reserves? What your projected reduction would be in the subsequent fiscal year?
Well, based on this scenario, you basically would be dropping, I mean, I prefer to look at this at 11 and 12 if you really, I mean, those are 2 years that we can probably be fairly, look at this and say, because we already know we know all of 11's revenues for the most part that are positives that will most likely be coming to us. We don't know necessarily what the state's going to reduce, but we do know what we're coming in terms of taxes. What we don't know is 12, but we know one part of 12 in terms of that. So I think 11 and 12, the revenue we can be fairly comfortable with. When I'm looking at this, you're dropping down to a low point of $38,000 in 13. So at the minimum, to be really comfortable, you'd need another $500,000 of reductions to come forward in fiscal 13 or revenue enhancements at a minimum. That's not going to get you to your fund balance portion, but that is going to give you a pretty strong guarantee not to have to go into tax anticipation warrants. It also then begins to pick up again in terms of this. I also want to say, because I have to get this out there, because as Dr. Krizik says, I don't want you to beat me up at the end of the year again on this. I'm very concerned about the state. I'm very concerned about only using 10%. I'm trying, we all discussed this for a long time. We argued, we discussed, we, went back and forth. We tried to balance, our feeling about having to make reductions at all versus what's a reality. All of my business managers in the area, and I surveyed them, are using at a minimum 15 to 20 to 25%. Some are using as much as 50 for their projections. So 10%, we already know 10% is going to happen. There's no surprise there. We've lost 10% every single year. So we already know that's going to happen. We won't be surprised about that, but it certainly could be a lot more than that. And so I just, need to give you that caution.
Appreciate your candor. Thank you.
Mrs. Conroy, would you like to give us a number?
This is one of the hardest decisions we're going to make as board members. That's an understatement. And listening to everything everyone's had to say, I'd like to say we could go with the lowest number, but I too have reservations about the state. So I'm going to have to go with a 2.3.
Okay, so nobody wants to go with the high range. And again, I'd like to reconcile where Mr. Collins and Ms. Hirsch are, just to confirm. We've talked about 1.5 and the $2 million, and I just want to make sure the difference there isn't the revenue enhancements, that what we're really talking about is a combined number of, we need to find opportunities for additional revenue and for ways to cut expense. But my position right now is I would support the $2 million number, but I think we need to start our next year's process pretty quickly. There's some big items on this list that, to me, are knee-jerk things. If they really don't make sense, what we had tonight was great opportunity to see when you put the research behind it and you spend the time and you go through it and you come up with your recommendations. They don't always have to be more money. And I think that some of the things on the list, and again, we're not talking to them, but about them, but I think there's opportunity to look at things in a different way. And I'm concerned about cutting some. You can't put a program back. We took $350,000 out of supplies, or $390,000 out of supplies last year. You can't do that in perpetuity. I mean, that's a one-year thing. If we're saying, okay, everybody's got to bring their own whatever to school, I mean, you can only tighten up those belts for so long. So, I mean, we have to make these decisions. I just don't want to make a decision that in a year we're going to say, boy, I wish we could have found a way to keep that. And that's my biggest rationale for the bigger one. I understand that we are putting some risk here. I hear what you're saying, Ms. Masterton. We could be in a deeper hole next year, thinking, man, if we could have just tightened it up a little bit, because the compounding of the savings are really what's going to have the longer-term impact. And I hear all that. I just think that we need to really spend some time on this, and we have to do what we need to keep our budget balanced for this year. But I'm concerned about doing something too quickly related to next year. So that's my opinion. Mr. Collins?
Just to clarify, the number that I threw out there is an optimistic number. I was going to say conservative, but it's not. It's optimistic. And puts a very reasonable likelihood that we're having the same discussion a year from now. And I only threw it out there because there's also a reasonable likelihood that we look back and say, wow, things picked up and everything was good. I'm just saying that the uncertainty is so that if we if we were to choose an absolute minimum number, that is the number I threw out. That did not assume any of these new anticipated expenditures. No new curricula, no new nothing, but it did assume the revenue enhancements that were proposed. And maybe we can come up with new revenue enhancements. I'm just saying as a baseline number, then over the next 6 weeks, we just have to carefully make sure that if we're spending money, we need to cut from the other side.
Okay, so what we have to do here, though, is you're starting from a different place than the rest of the board. So what we have to do is we have to all start from the same place. So we've been presented a proposed budget. If it's your opinion that some of these additional things could be some of those things that we cut in order to get back to the same place, then that's fair game, and that will be part of our discussion. But we all have to start from the same level playing field. It's the scenarios where those expenditures are in there. We're starting from the scenario where we're assuming a 10% reduction in state revenues, and from that point, what are we as a board, what direction are we going to give to the administration as far as the cuts? And again, we'll have opportunity to sound off on what those things should be, whether it's delay of curriculum, elimination of updating curriculum. That's going to be all part of the second discussion. But for right now, we can't be reconciling where we're starting from. We all have to start from the same point.
And that's fine. So if you're asking me, I mean, this is always my trouble with multiple choice tests. I always wanted an answer that wasn't there. I'll take choice C, $2,050,000.
I'm going to make Ms. Hirsch start at the same point that we are too. So can you just come back with, based upon us all starting at the same place and assuming that the putting those things on the list is the second part of the discussion, where would your number be?
The number is the 2 million number. It's, I agree with you that the dollar amount is the dollar amount that I'm comfortable with. The different place is, what are the considerations that the board is willing to take under advisement in terms of how we're going to get to that number. So the number is, option C, I guess, 2 million. But the one thing that I want to state, because there have been some comments in terms of, is it the board member's responsibility to pick and choose and balance if we make this cut or if we make that cut? And I will tell you that I believe that, in school board parlance, which I have learned in the last, 9 months on the job, there is a discussion of what is appropriate for the board to discuss and what is appropriate for the administration to discuss. But the thing that I do want to reiterate, that when you look at these particular cuts, or you take additions into consideration, what is important to me is the value that is placing. In other words, I may be for or against a specific cut, but what I'm trying to reflect is that in my experience, and I'm not stating this as my position, I'm just using it as an example, our community really values elementary world language. And so while I might be advocating for or against a specific addition or potential cut, I do believe that it is the board's responsibility to reflect the values. If it is in fact that we are going to put curriculum adoptions on hold, it's because we make a trade-off. We make that determination that we are willing to put curriculum adoption on hold, whether it's postponing for 1 year and then bringing it back in, or reducing the amount of curriculum adoption. Those are value statements that I do believe that it is the board's responsibility to make in terms of, given our current financial situation, what are we willing to put forth. So, sorry, I just wanted to clarify that was very important to me, because I agree with you. It's not the board's job to sit here and go tit for tat and try to come up with the right mix. But it is our responsibility in terms of values and what our community values. That's very important to me. So option C.
Okay, so we seem to have a consensus around the $2 million number. And I guess I'm looking for, Dr. Krizik, are you looking for a motion, or are you looking for just the consensus? Although I know there were several individuals higher when I do my informal counting. So that's the first question. And the second question is, I guess I'll look for board input on this. Mr. Carlquist, you referenced earlier just the sequencing. And my rationale in the sequencing was we get the amount out there, people have an idea of magnitude, they get the opportunity, knowing that, to come and speak to us, understanding what some of the big and small pieces are, and with the most amount of community input, then we as a board deliberate. We could certainly go the other way. I was just looking for the opportunity to get the most input from the community, and that was my call. So I'm open to changing these, although we've disseminated it widely in the community. So
There is an action item on the agenda tonight. We didn't fill in the amount, but there is certainly an action item that will then basically give a charge to the administration about how to begin the next part of the process, understanding all of the conversations that have taken place at the board table here this evening. The various ways how we might get to that number and how that has expanded and grown, and we certainly understand that. But there is an action item, and we really would like some definitive piece so that when we come back to the next meeting, we're not revisiting the number again. So we are asking for some action.
Mr. Carlquist.
See if I can try to formulate an action that is reflective of all the interests that I heard from the board this evening. I would say I move that the Board of Education direct the administration to develop and present at its next meeting a set of recommendations that include revenue enhancement options and budget or expenditure reduction options for achieving at minimum $2 million and $2,050,000 for the fiscal 10-11 budget year. Did I include all of our collective interests in that? Period.
Moved by Mr. Carlquist, second by Mrs. Davy. Any board discussion? Ms. Hirsch?
I guess it's just a request in terms of the process moving forward, that we do have complete picture and good discussion around the particular options that we are going to be taking into consideration. So whether that is, if there are, I know that there has been a great response, I believe, to our survey, and I'd like to see that information put out as quickly, not only the board here, but those ideas, if it's at all possible to try to, put some gel around some of those ideas, and if there are some great revenue ideas, to have those brought forward to the board next time, not just start with the list that we have now, but include those ideas that have been brought forward at the discussion, if it's at all possible. I know it's a lot of work, but I think it's important.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Krizik, we should get the first update this week, and then we'll get another update at the end of next week, and then based upon how much additional input we get, it'll be a periodic update, but we should have major content prior to our discussion. Mr. Collins.
Just one point of clarification. I think I've said this a few times, but just for everyone to understand, the lower the number we choose, and we've chosen the lowest one, the higher the probability is that we're back here next year having this exact same extremely painful discussion. But in light of the circumstances that we're in right now, that's a risk I'm willing to take. But just so everybody understands, it could be deja vu next year.
Mr. Carlquist.
Mrs. Ostiak, first of all, I want to thank you and compliment you for taking the input from the board in both outlining a process and two, specifically taking the request or the interest to heart and around having a public forum. Maybe my suggestion to address the question that I raised earlier was if we perhaps could, keep the original intent of a public forum, which is an opportunity to provide input, but there's no state statute that requires sequencing of public comment. So perhaps if we inverted our meeting and started with the recommendations, had discussion of the Board of Education, the board needs to be mindful of the fact that we would have community members, employees, and the like who would want to be able to respond, but give them that opportunity to respond, much like we would in a workshop format, which would that way, get the information out, positioned. Our job, which is to conduct a meeting in the public, get that input, and then still be able to keep us marching on this timeline to be able to make adjustments, request additional reaction from the administration or data that might be required on the 16th. And because I also am concerned, because I've seen this in the past with this with this district, is if we have a timeline that takes us right to the March 9th date and leave ourselves no buffer for final resolution, that also, I think, is, has its own peril, so.
The only comment I would make with regard to that, Mr. Carlquist, is I would like to think that my administrators listen carefully to the feedback that we get at the table from all of you. And then our ability to craft a recommendation comes in large part from how you have integrated and reflected information from a variety of sources, whether that's from feedback, from public comment, from the community, from the administrators. And so I'm a little concerned about putting forth a package, so to speak, for you to begin to deliberate on, to speak to Mrs. Hirsch's, is that, I mean, did I misinterpret something? I guess I thought I heard you say to present at the next meeting what $2 million in reductions is going to look like. Combination of revenue enhancers, delayed expenditures, so on and so forth. We don't have the full, we as a cabinet don't have the full benefit of your deliberations. And to speak to Ms. Hirsch's point about hearing clearly some of the value pieces, I'm concerned.
I agree with that, but this may be a little bit of chicken and egg, because how then can we expect the community, stakeholders, parents, taxpayers, employees and the like, to provide meaningful input if we've provided a channel to give input on idea generation, right? What about this for increasing revenue? What about this for cutting expense? What about running without a business manager and a superintendent for a year, right? I mean, so we've got lots of input. What's needed is to go to the next step, and maybe it's a step short of hard, fast recommendations, say, you shall do this. But I think, and again, we're trying to sort this out, but I hear you saying until you have reaction and input and discussion from the board, how would you know where to draw the line? But at the same time, how can the public react? So I think come forward with the straw man. I mean, an administrative recommendation or a proposal, or put it into options, or you decide with your staff's help how you would frame it. Give the board a chance to, first of all, understand we have not had a public meeting, a public discussion around how you would come up with $1.5 million of reductions. We got a spreadsheet just like everyone else in the public did, but there hasn't been a public meeting and a public discussion. Each of us picked out a few things this evening. So we need to have that discussion. And I know, again, chicken egg, you're looking for reaction from the board, but I think you need to lead. The administration needs to lead. The board needs to be able to reflect the values of the community and play our role, as Ms. Hirsch said. Then there needs to be an opportunity for public reaction. And then it doesn't stop there. We have 3 more meetings. Boom, boom, boom. The 16th, the 23rd. 3 more meetings left to be able to then massage, iterate around what we've heard, what you've heard, and because I don't think any of us would hold your feet to the fire to that the first, the next set or the first public discussion around how we might be able to solve this Rubik's Cube is what we will ultimately land on. So as long as you understand, we're not looking for you to do Six Sigma, complete solution on the first, the first go around. That's my sense. Otherwise, I think we're all kind of looking for the first to lead the dance.
I'm going to suggest an alternative, and I think your idea is a creative one of maybe we have some board discussion first, and we've got a list. We've got a list of $3 point something million, I think, whatever the total value was with the add-ons. If, as a board, we could take the opportunity to start saying, we wouldn't touch this, or, yep, we'd look at these. And based upon that input, that might give the administration some form to say, okay, based upon what you've told me, here's how I would narrow down the list. This is the stuff you have to focus on. I mean, that would be another option. I'm going to go Mr. Collins and then Ms. Hirsch.
Yeah, maybe we start out with a presentation from the administration on the list already submitted in a little more detail on what, I mean, right now we have a sentence fragment about each suggestion. So a little more detail on each one, and the administration will have the advantage of, as suggestions come in on the web, the revenue enhancement and cost reduction ideas, and present the most promising of those as well. So we have, you know, the community starts with a list to pick from. And I have to say, from that point on, I view my job as purely to listen. And then on March 9th, figure out how we're going to make the target we just set.
Okay, Ms. Hirsch.
What I was trying to communicate earlier was that, to me, it's critically important. We've asked the community, in fact, we've directed the community in talking with PTAs and on the website and through various vehicles to please direct all of their requests, ideas, thoughts, concerns, suggestions for revenue generator or cuts to this survey. And if we do not take into account and review and tee up some of those ideas that come in from the community, then the point of surveying was moot. We have a responsibility, once we put that survey out there, ask the community for feedback. We have the complete responsibility to look through every single one of those suggestions, to ask the superintendent and her team to tee up and say, this is a realistic one or this is unrealistic. But all of those need to be taken into account. So earlier this evening I said some of those assumed new expenditures for next year and the following year, those need to be on the table. The expenses, you know, the expenditures that have been already proposed in terms of potential cuts are on the table. Any new ideas that come from the community also need to be on the same table. So as we're trying to put the jigsaw puzzle together and come up with a complete picture, we are working with all of the resources that we are trying to garner. So it's not an easy process. It's an involved process. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of energy. But what the benefit of this process and what we're trying to accomplish is that we are looking under every rock. We are taking everything into consideration to have the least amount of impact on our students' achievement, on our staff, and their experiences with the district. So to me, I want to take that community input into account. Now, I realize it's a very difficult, unwieldy process to take, you know, web submission surveys and to try to assimilate those and organize those into thoughts, but we have an absolute responsibility to look at all of those ideas and to take them into consideration as we're discussing potentials.
You're going to get your first update this week, and you'll get your next update at the end of next week. So that will be the substance of what anybody that wanted to communicate up to this point, that will all be available prior to the next meeting. So what part of that isn't meeting your needs? That's what I'm trying to understand here.
I guess what I'm trying to communicate is I don't want just a report. I'm happy to read through the 150 pages or however many emails we get, but I want to see us take action on those ideas. If there are viable ideas in there, when we address and start learning about and better understanding some of the line items that have been proposed, that those, if there are valid ideas in there, that it's not just a report that we're reading, and it's up to the board members to go through that 100-page report, pull ideas out and say, well, what about this revenue source? I'm asking the administration as well. When there are revenue sources that are proposed as ideas, that those are vetted by the administration as either unrealistic or possible or really good idea, and those are included in the tools that we have available of us to meet this $2 million number.
I completely agree, and we said we want to get as much community input and understand that as we're doing our deliberation. However, what you're talking about is a board meeting. The board discussion about what about this, we value that, that's a board meeting. And so what we're suggesting is that on the date for February 9th, we start out with board discussion, and then we give the community a chance to provide us feedback based upon what they've heard, and let us know if they think we're going in the right direction, and then that gives us direction on how to frame this, and that's the proposed process. Mrs. Davy.
I think it's probably important that we don't have any sort of recommendation on the 9th from the administration, because I think that's jumping the gun. I think just hearing what we're hearing, we have to have this meeting on the 9th to synthesize community input and just all the information that we're hearing, have a good discussion. It'll be the first time we will have heard point by point the specifics of the programs. Now we're going to add on talking about the possible, not doing curriculum implementation. So there's a whole lot of things I think we need to talk about, and I do not think it would be fair. I think it would be presumptive to ask the administration to put anything down as a recommendation for that night. I think that night needs to be purely for us to synthesize everything, as Maria said, that's on the table that we have that we need to talk about. And that will include the administration just describing in more detail each of the items, and then us have a conversation around that. So I think I'm supporting, Mrs. Ostojic, what your original yellow paper says. The 9th is just it's a conversation and it's a presentation talking about on the cuts, and then the community input, which we will be getting, and then it's the next meeting, the 16th. Maybe that's the meeting where Dr. Krizik has had enough time to have heard and synthesize what she may want to put a couple of scenarios together. I don't know. I would leave that for her, but that would be my vision of how this would proceed.
I do like the suggestion of not necessarily having public comment first as part of our next meeting, though. I do think that it would be, I think that at our last meeting and this meeting, I think the presentations have been very thoughtful in terms of the community speaking to us these past 2 meetings. They have been articulate, they have been thoughtful, and I think in order to work towards the we versus us and them, I think it would be in the best interest to first have a conversation and then to have public comment weigh in after that. It would be the closest thing to a dialogue at a public meeting, and I think that would be valued and appreciated by our community, and I think that would be helpful for the board. So I do think that we would structure our meeting different, and if that means that we are deliberating for an hour and a half before we have public comment in order to have that thoughtful conversation, I think that's what that means. So that's what I mean, I do like that suggestion, that we don't start out with public comment, because I think it is hard for someone to weigh in on something without having had the benefit of hearing all of the rationale. And so if we could structure it that way, I think that would be helpful. And I do believe that subsequently we can then put some scenarios together for board deliberation on, based on what we hear.
I'm going to ask Mrs. Walsh, can you reconfirm what the motion is? Because I want to make sure that what we're voting on is really where we are now, that we don't need to amend the motion.
Mr. Carlquist moves that the Board of Education direct the administration to develop and present a set of recommendations for revenue enhancements and revenue reductions at the $2,050,000 level for the 2010-11 budget year.
The only clarification was that's summed to at a minimum.
Yeah, at a minimum, I'm sorry.
The list that we've been talking about
Right.
is actually, as pointed out, is over $3 million. So again, I don't want any of us to get hung up over the words recommendation. I mean, this really is a set of proposals, options, that's why I said however it's configured, such that we can have a public discussion of what's under consideration, what ideas, but coming from the administration, it needs to be stronger than a set of ideas. It needs to be grounded in thoughtful education, pedagogy or what have you, and so it needs to be stronger than just random thoughts.
Okay, the recommendation on the board agenda is much narrower than that. It says that the board approve a reduction amount, and the goal of that was to start framing how much this has to be, not necessarily what's on that list. So I guess I would ask Mr. Carlquist first if you'd consider pulling back and making it a more...
Well, so thank you. I mean, I will clarify. I mean, I think I will tighten it up by saying, there's two parts to it, right? We're asking for, and that's through this discussion, we're asking for a list of considerations that exceeds the amount. So the edit or the suggested refinement to the motion is that the board is in that process is committing to a set of reduction, is committing to a budget adjustment that meets or exceeds the $2,050,000, in addition to the other aspects of the motion, which was asking for the proposals or ideas.
Okay, so with the vote, we will approve that amount. We have an initial list of items. We will get additional input from community, and based upon that, we'll start our conversation at the next board meeting. We'll give the community a chance to provide feedback based upon what they're hearing from us. And then I still think we need to have a pretty thorough vetting meeting with a significant amount of time to go through what we've heard, what we think, what we've heard based upon our initial deliberation. So I would still recommend that we have the February 16th meeting, and then we have to start from that point drilling down. I agree with, we may have the final vote on March 9th. The action is required there, but, as we're going through the process, I think we need to start narrowing this down in scope, but I agree. I think we need to stay broad and look at everything initially, and then start filtering out the places that we're really not willing to consider. Are we all on the same page with that? I'm sorry, this is board table discussion.
But if you don't have public input comments on February 9th,
Excuse me, there's no public discussion at this part of the meeting. This is board table discussion. If you want to do public comment, the portion of the public comment is at the beginning of the board meeting. Okay, so I'm looking for board consensus or input on this. Mrs. Deroni? Okay.
There's a motion on the floor which I would like to speak to, and that is I am not going to be able to support it because I don't believe the number is high enough. I think it puts our district at risk.
Okay. Any other board discussion on the motion? Mr. Collins?
I agree with the process that Mr. Carlquist laid out and that you amended. But I just also have one suggestion. Can we put the link to the form directly on the front page of the district website? Can we put the link to the suggestion form directly on the first page of the district website? Because right now you have to click on that story, click more, go to the bottom, click the link. I would hate to miss one really good suggestion because it's hard to find.
Ms. Hirsch?
Just one idea for the meeting where we're looking to get as much feedback. You might consider structuring it as a workshop meeting where we actually did a topic. We break the potentials into 3 or 4 different groups so that you could have discussion, and then once we're done talking about operations and maintenance type things, we could handle questions. Just an idea to help structure the conversation and allow the community members to focus their comments on a topic.
Mr. Carlquist?
Mrs. Deroni, I appreciate the concern that you raised, and I too am concerned, but I would also, I think, point out, not necessarily that it will change and seek your support for what I hope will have the majority of the board, but the motion by design is intended to set as a minimum that reduction target. What I was concerned about from the discussion earlier is that there might have been board members or a majority of the board that would have been willing to put this district at even greater risk of having reductions less than the minimum of what was presented. I think the language of the motion, however awkwardly it was worded, was intended to address the two pieces. Have the board commit tonight to the minimum of the $2 million, which I hope you would support at least that reduction, and then secondarily asking the administration to begin to supply information that, as I said, went beyond the $3 million that was in my original motion, such that we have, the board still has at its discretion the ability to go further with the reductions if it was the pleasure of the majority of the board. So I would hope that you would at least support that minimum level, number one. And then number two, this timeline, which 4 more meetings that go on, I think these are monumental decisions. And while on one hand, and I'm concerned that this one process might monopolize a time such that, Dr. Krisner, maybe you could address this question. What other pressing business needs of the district, including whether pressing needs might be jeopardized by this timeline. But at the same time, I think as a Board of Education, we should be taking as much time as we possibly can up to the March 9th date, which is only a deadline for potential riffing. We have through September to continue to work on this process to be able to get to what we think is the final number, and we ought to use that timeline as well. Dr. Krizek?
About 2 weeks ago, I had tried to lay out a template for Mrs. Ostrich to consider in terms of the next 5 meetings moving forward date, in terms of what was on our calendar, what we were trying to attempt to accomplish. One is the ELL study that we did not put on tonight's meeting, but but for a variety of reasons. But we do have that. We're going to have a follow-up on a capital project update. That can potentially be deferred. We have a single item tonight, hopefully, that you can take action on at some point in time. The TIF update, whenever we want to have that conversation. I'm not prioritizing these, but the ELL study. We were going to do a strategic plan update. We were certainly going to have our own state of the district update. We needed to have a facility fee discussion. We need to give you a framework for which, because that is one of the revenue enhancers, and you're going to have to take action on that, and that has implications. And so we are going to need to have a conversation around facility fees, enough time for deliberation, so that when you're going to be acting on it, you know, that there's been enough conversation. We have generally tried in the past to have our calendar, you know, a 2-year out calendar. So our intent was at the end of February to bring forth the 2011-2012 calendar for just approval. Not that you spend a lot of time discussing it, but that is certainly something on the agenda. We certainly have, again, the middle school science at the first phase of the adoption process by just kind of doing a general overview and presentation. Our goal there was to have that to be in the beginning of March with action taken at the end of March. Certainly, there was an insurance report update with Lockton. This was, I'm not going to say it's on the high priority list, but that was one of our particular pieces that we wanted to talk about. Those were the key things. Now, certainly, can we defer a strategic plan update? We probably can defer that. Can we defer the ELL study? We can't. That has implications and recommendations that'll come forth. We cannot defer the facility fee presentation. We cannot, we could defer the approval of the 11-12 calendar and put that onto March. It's just, again, we've tried to maintain a schedule. If we're off a month, we're off a month. And could we defer the state of the district update? We could, although there's a part of me that feels that at some point, and certainly it's not going to be ready now on February 9th, but that puts a framework around where we are and where we're headed. And so just as I think tonight's presentations were important for a larger part of the discussion, because I think when we look at the groundwork or the recommendations that were in the REACH study that have to come forth, and Mr. Collins earlier this evening asked for a further discussion around the REACH study, you know, that's a lot on the table for the board. And all of those things are critical. So, and I.
Thank you.
My one last comment is that I didn't even put on here any policy discussion. I didn't even put on first drafts of policies. It's not even on here anywhere. And with all due respect to how hard Ms. Hirsch has worked on policies, there's a part of me that wants to say we need to suspend policy meetings, because the amount of work that this cabinet is doing and is going to have to continue to do to get this community to the point of feeling good about these directions is an incredible amount of work. And I'm not saying that they don't work hard or we won't work hard, and that the policy isn't a priority that we've dragged out for 2 years because procedures are connected to it. But we we want to be as thoughtful and thorough on everything that we present to you, not on some things. And I am very concerned about our internal capacity to be able to supply all of the information with all of the other competing objectives. I guess I just needed to say that.
Ms. Hirsch.
I am not understanding, Mr. Carlquist, what your motion was, and I'd like to have it read back. My understanding was that we were going to make a recommendation, and we had agreed upon, or we were going to vote on a cut that was targeted at $2,050,000 exactly, and not $2,050,000 or above. And so either we can vote on the
Thank you, Becky.
what's on the table now, and if that is the case, if the wording is such that it's $2,050,000 and over, I will be voting no, because my understanding was that we had what I'd like to see is $2,050,000 and not $2,050,000 and above. So, Mrs. Walsh, if you could read back, I want to make sure I understand what the wording is.
I can clarify. I mean, if you go ahead and whatever you think you heard, but the intent of the motion was specifically, as I said, that the board, we had discussion with some board members saying, I wouldn't want to go north of that, others saying, I think we should be north of it, and it was to strike that and to say, at a minimum, I think there was agreement that at a minimum, we would have reduction of the $2,050,000, and then we would ask the administration to come forward with a set of options, recommendations, whatever the descriptor is, that would be sufficient to get to that number at a minimum.
That was not my understanding of what my indication was to Mrs. Ostojic. I was asked specifically, do you want A, B, or C? And my specific response was, I choose C, not C or above. So I need to clarify what it is that we are voting on, because I'm not comfortable with C or above.
I think the other point is, and I heard this from Mrs. Davy, and it was my position too, I'm not looking for an initial list. What we're trying, options. But what we're trying to do first is say, here's what it is. How much are we looking to cut? And I understand, Mrs. Deroni, you're definitely on board for a higher amount. So I guess what we can do is vote on Mr. Carlquist, unless you want to try to amend your motion, vote on it.
As I said, I was just trying to craft a motion that I thought reflected the interest of the board. So, Mrs. Hirsch, if you have I'll gladly withdraw the motion if you'd like to put another out there. But I thought there were heads bobbing, there was sufficient interest that said that the $2,050,000 was the minimum cut. The minimum cut. It doesn't imply that we're going to go north of that, although there are two board members that have said they would. And it means we wouldn't go lower. At a minimum, $2 million that we're committing, which then gives, that sizes the envelope for the administration to be able to go. If you have better language, let's vote on it one way or another and see and try again.
So if you're withdrawing your motion, who's, oh, okay, okay.
Your suggestion, let's just put it out there. Call the question.
Call the question. So we'll vote on this. If this is consistent with what you would like, then vote yes. If it's not, vote no, and we'll accept another motion. Mrs. Walsh, can you call the roll, please?
Mr. Carlquist.
Yes.
Mrs. Davy.
Yes.
Mr. Collins.
Yes.
Ms. Conroy.
Can you repeat the motion?
Originally, Mr. Carlquist stated that he was moving that the Board of Education direct the administration to develop, at a minimum, develop and present a set of recommendations and revenue enhancements and revenue reductions at a minimum of $2,050,000 for the 2010-11 budget year.
Correct. And then at Mrs. Ostojic's suggestion, clarified it to be more explicit to the administration around what the board was prepared or willing to commit to in terms of reduction. And that was where we I suggested, added the additional language of the board is committing to a minimum reduction of the $2,050,000 as presented in option C.
Would it be a better idea if we added some language in there? Yeah, would it be a better idea if maybe we added a sentence in there that said, you know, a targeted amount at a minimum of, to not say that we're going to cut $4 million, but the target is $2,050,000, and if it ends up $2,075,000 or $2,100,000, it's hard to get it to that exact number.
I don't disagree, and that's what minimum means. Let's, if we could, point of order, at least continue with.
Mrs. Walsh, continue with the roll call, please.
Ms. Conroy? Mrs. Deroni?
No.
Ms. Hirsch?
No.
Mrs. Ostojic?
No. That motion fails. I will accept another motion. Would somebody like to propose a motion? I don't believe that language was exactly where we wanted to go with this. I will offer that the board, the recommendation from the administration was to state the Board of Education approve a budget reduction amount. The process that we've talked about is having some conversation. We have a list, having the list that continue to be added upon, and then from that, we will come up with a finite budget reduction list. Mr. Carlquist.
Make it real simple, everyone. I move that the Board of Education commit to option C for budget reductions.
Is there a second? Second by Mrs. Davy. Any board discussion? Mrs. Walsh, please call the roll.
Mr. Carlquist? Mrs. Davy? Mr. Collins?
Yes.
Ms. Conroy? Mrs. Deroni?
No.
Mrs. Hirsch?
Yes.
Mrs. Ostojic?
Yes. So we have 5 ayes, 2 nays. The motion carries. Okay. We will move to the superintendent's consent agenda. May I have a motion, please?
Should we approve the minutes first? Would you like a motion for the minutes, Mrs. Ostojic?
Thank you. We have the minutes for the November 30th special meeting, December 8th business meeting, January 7th special meeting, and January 12th workshop meeting that are available. Are there any amendments or corrections to those minutes? Seeing that, they'll be approved as presented. We need to have a motion to accept the superintendent's consent agenda. Can I have a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. Conroy, seconded by Ms. Hirsch. Is there any items to be removed from the agenda? Okay. There is dollar amounts involved here, so Mrs. Walsh, can you please call the roll?
Ms. Conroy? Ms. Hirsch?
Yes.
Mr. Carlquist? Mr. Collins?
Yes.
Mrs. Davy? Yes. Mrs. Deroni?
Yes.
Mrs. Ostojic?
Yes, 7 ayes, no nays. The motion carries. We have one action item coming out of the superintendent's agenda, and it is item C because we've already addressed the other 2 items in our prior discussions. I will accept a motion. Mrs. Davy?
I move that the Board of Education authorize the administration to solicit bids for the replacement of the roof at Madison School and Tuck Point and Workett Field and Madison Schools.
Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. Collins. Any board discussion? Dr. Krizik, would you like to give any background to this?
At a previous meeting, we outlined a variety of different capital projects. We deliberated administratively and felt that these were the most necessary ones to, in terms of preventing any future cost to be incurred by not going forward with these 2 particular projects. And we think this is the most, the minimal amount of work that we would want to do going forward. We continue to believe it's a favorable bidding climate. We know a neighboring district received at least 20 bids for roof work, so we do think this is going to be another great year for being able to secure high-quality work at a low cost. We do have the capital funds available. It does not come out of O&M. It comes out of Fund 61. And so we do have the funds available to do this work, and in addition, the roof potentially could be available for life safety work. We would make that application for a life safety amendment and use life safety funds potentially for that as well. I think there's a little over $785,000 or a little over $750,000 in life safety fund. So again, these are our minimum recommendations. It's the first step in the process. You're giving us the opportunity to solicit bids. At some point in time, you will have an action item whether you're going to accept those bids or not. So by just making this approval tonight doesn't necessarily mean the work will go forward, but it's the first step in order to get the process going.
Is there any board discussion? Ms. Hirsch?
Dr. Krzyk, I had a question that hadn't been answered, and that was that I had submitted earlier, and that was that these funds are coming out of Fund 61, which, if I go back through my notes, my understanding is that Fund 61 actually is our debt certificate funds that are sitting there. At a previous capital update, we had received information that we had $2.2 million sitting in that debt certificate fund, and yet some of that money was going to be earmarked or had already been spent on the Emerson addition. So my question is, one, what is the balance on those, the debt certificate fund 61? And is there an option for early repayment if we do have funds sitting in that account? Is there a penalty to that? That's an option as well for reducing in a small way our payback on those debt certificates.
The Emerson addition monies all came out of Fund 60, not Fund 61. Fund 61 was simply for the York Stadium and for the 162. Those were, and I'm going to take it back, the Bryan parking lot as well. So all of the funds came out of Fund 60 for Emerson. You cannot use funds from Fund 60 for Madison. We would have to transfer interest over into another fund in order to do that, which we would be able to do if we needed to. There is approximately $780,000 or so in Fund 61 remaining. There's also fund in 62 funds in 62 and in Fire, Life, and Safety. So,
and do we have the option to repay those debt certificates early to reduce our debt load and reduce our payouts on those loans?
We do, but that would really only take care of a year or two, and the maintenance costs and it would simply decimate the fund completely. We wouldn't have money to do the roof, which we really need to do. The Madison roof is really, really in poor shape, and it needs to be. And we generally look at this and go, why would we want to throw good money after bad? We're going to have to do extensive repairs and patching. That costs money. It would be less expensive. It's a great bidding climate to move forward and go ahead and put the roof in.
I'm not recommending that we not do the work. My question is, do we need to use, if we still have $780,000 of money that we borrowed last December, a year ago December, is there an option for us to pay that money back early?
There is.
And we have other funds available to cover the Madison roof in Fund 62, which is old Fund 20.
We would have, that capital projects needs to last for another 2 to 3 years, and there are other roofs that are going to come forward from here. It's not just the Madison roof. Madison roof is just this year. If you look at the long-term projects, there are other needs that come forward from that.
I'm fully aware of the 10-year capital plan that we have and the needs that we have. I'm just looking to see if we can return that money early and reduce the monies that are coming out of our O&M fund for this upcoming school year, because that's the fund that is being used, correct, to repay those debt certificates.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, we do not have money on this. It's just soliciting a bid, so we will have a voice vote. All in favor of this motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? This motion carries. Our next item on our agenda is upcoming board meetings. We've had a lot of discussion about some of the meetings. We have a meeting this Thursday, policy meeting of the whole, which will be in the District Center on 162 South York. That starts at 7 p.m. On Tuesday, February 9th, we're going to have a Board of Education workshop meeting. We are going to try to determine the best location because I understand it's difficult for the media to get set up here. So that location will be TBD. We are anticipating a large crowd. So again, our capacity at 162 South York is only 215 people. So we will probably look for other options for that meeting. We have We have a tentative meeting scheduled for February 16th, and we'll have additional communication on that. And then our next scheduled Board of Education business meeting is February 23rd. We have an action coming out of closed session relating to student discipline. May I have a motion? Mrs. DeRoni?
I move that the Board of Education permit the Partners for Success student discussed in closed session to re-enroll at York High School effective January 27th, 2010, in accordance with the recommendation of the superintendent and administration.
Moved by Mrs. DeRoni, second by Mr. Carlquist. Any board discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye. Those opposed? That motion carries. Our next item on the agenda is board communications. Are there any committee reports? Mrs. Davy?
I'll just be very brief. We went to LEN this last week, and the conversation continues to be the state's involvement in the race to the top and budget deficit issues, school by school. Many of which are far more significant than ours that we're sitting here discussing and agonizing over. But it does not appear that the state of Illinois will get the race to the top money. That is the preliminary indication, but that doesn't mean there isn't a round two, if you recall the proposal. So it's not looking like we're thinking we're like they're only giving it to 10 states, and we're probably number 16 to 18. So we would probably be in a much better position to get it the second round. I believe that's in June when they'll reevaluate.
Thank you. Our next, I'm sorry, Mrs. DeRoni.
I just wanted to say, I heard the administration suggest to us that we suspend our policy meeting since we have one coming up on Thursday. Do we want to talk about that?
I'm not suggesting to suspend this Thursdays. I'm just suggesting after Thursday, if we could just take a little bit of a breather, because there's just a lot of work to be done in the month of February. It's just a suggestion. I am speaking on, it's just a suggestion. This has been a prolonged process, and I know that everyone is, the longer we prolong it, the more difficult it is. I'm only just saying there is a tremendous amount of work also to be done around this that directly affects student lives, and I guess I just am asking for the board to consider priorities when we established our next meeting date when we meet on Thursday.
Ms. Hirsch, would you like to make any comment?
We are getting dangerously close to wrapping up our initial pass. We do have Section 7, which is students, which we have about, I think, maybe 8 or 9 policies to review this Thursday. And then we have a list of policies to review in Section 2, which regard to the board and how the board operates. And I met with Dr. Krizik and Ellen Walsh, the other Ellen Walsh, to try to narrow down what our outstanding policies are that need to be discussed a little bit further. We are getting very, very close to actually wrapping this up and being able to hand it off to the IASB press organization, which is IASB, which is actually going to integrate all of our changes. So if we can consider gutting it out and getting through 2 meetings, we can be sensitive to the scheduling of the meetings. We might end up taking the month of February off, but I think if we can do 2 or 3 more meetings, we can pass this off to the IASB. I set a personal goal. I'd love to have our policy manual presented back to the board in time for the national conference. I don't know that that's realistic, but that's where I'm in, so I'd like to keep plodding along with policy.
So we have a meeting scheduled for this Thursday. We're not talking about canceling that. We are talking about taking February off, so there is a break there, and then picking it back up in March when we should be through much of this. Does that sound reasonable, Mrs. DeRoni? Okay. Any other board discussion on that? In regard to the facility referendum, we had several board members that were able to attend PTA meetings over the last month to have discussion on that. Also, due to the timing, there was a lot of discussion on some of the budget items. Is there any board updates that you'd like to share from those discussions? No, well, I'll just say from the discussion I had, there were not many new questions. One new question that did come up was, if the referendum were to pass, would we have to pass a referendum if we were ever to sell that building? And Dr. Krizik confirmed the answer to that is no. We do not need a referendum to sell a building. I had some great feedback on it. Just want to remind everybody that February 2nd is when it will be on the ballot, and we hope people come out and vote. Items for future consideration? Nope. That would be the end of our agenda. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
By Ms. Hirsch, second. Second by Ms. Conroy. All in favor? Those opposed? This meeting is adjourned.